So I'm going to bring the picture of migration into Australia and talk about specifically exposure to carcinogens among migrants in Australia and comparing that exposure with Australian-born. And I'll initially just set the scene about the global migration of migrant workers. I'm just going to have to keep turning around so I can see the slides, I'm afraid. Yes, it's a bit too small, that font. Internationally, there are approximately 244 million migrants, and half of those migrate for work. They tend to be young and unskilled, and they do the 3D jobs, the males, which are the dirty, dangerous and difficult jobs, or increasingly female migrants do the caring, cooking and cleaning jobs. The international literature shows that migrants or immigrants have more work-related accidents and fatalities and injuries than native-born populations, and that's been shown from many countries. The picture is a bit more mixed in Australia, where some groups, New Zealanders have higher rates of work-related fatalities than the Australian-born, but other migrant groups haven't been found to have higher mortality. Of much less work has been done on exposure to other hazards at work, in particular carcinogens that cause the occupational cancers that are a big component of compensation and also of chronic disease in the population. And this is, in general, a very understudied research area, not just here, but globally. So just briefly to tell you about migration to Australia. We are a nation of migrants. 1 in 4 of us are born overseas. Approximately 60% have either one or both parents that were born overseas. Between the end of the Second World War and the 1970s, approximately 6 million largely European migrants arrived, and it was largely to build our manufacturing base and our infrastructure. From the 1970s, we broadened our intake a bit more and started bringing in people from other countries, and principally in the 70s it was from Southeast Asia. From the mid-1990s, we have focused on skilled migration, and today we have migrants coming from more than 180 countries. And since 2008, more than 2/3 of migrant visas issued every year, which ranges between 100 and 190,000, are to skilled migrants. We also have, as at September last year, we had 1.2 million people in Australia on a temporary visa. The bulk of these were visitors, but there was also 500,000 international students in that number, 138,000 457 or temporary work visas, and an equal number of working holiday visas. So increasingly temporary migration has been a big component of the Australian migration scene. I'm now going to tell you about a cross-sectional study that we conducted across Australia in 2013 to examine the exposure to workplace carcinogens among migrant workers. So it was a telephone survey, and we recruited, we didn't solely limit it to migrants because our recruitment method involved ringing people with a range of living in high-density suburbs from various ethnic groups and with the most common surname of Arabic, Vietnamese or Chinese surnames. So we couldn't then limit it to whether they were born overseas or not, although we did capture that information. So they were Australian-born or foreign-born, as I said. They had to be of working age, so between 18 and 65, to be currently employed and to live in either Sydney, Melbourne or Perth. So we recruited 750 people and roughly similar size of each group. So many people from ethnic backgrounds are excluded from epidemiological studies, largely because their English is not of a sufficient level to participate. So we were very sure in this study to offer the interview in either English or Arabic, Chinese, Mandarin or Cantonese or Vietnamese, so that we weren't necessarily excluding people who didn't speak English and who may be more vulnerable to exposure to a hazard at work. We asked them their job title, and then we asked about the tasks that they did in their job, and from their responses we were able to assign whether they were exposed to any of a 38 predetermined list of carcinogens. We had done previous work to ensure that these carcinogens were currently used in Australia in various manufacturing bases, and they were all recognised by the International Agency for Research into Cancer as being a probable or a type 2 possible carcinogen. So they include things like metals, so lead and nickel, or asbestos, silica, wood dust, combustion products, so diesel engine exhaust or polyaromatic hydrocarbons, environmental tobacco smoke, and other things like benzene and shift work. And so based on the answers to their job, to the answers to the tasks about what they did in their job, we assigned a level of exposure. So we didn't ask, are you exposed to asbestos? We asked, what tasks do you do in your job? And then from those answers, we assigned whether we thought they were exposed to asbestos. So of the 749 participants, 32% were assessed as probably exposed to at least one carcinogen in their workplace. The prevalence varied by ethnicity and sex, with men being more exposed than women and Arabs being much more exposed than the other two groups. The most common carcinogens for men were solar ultraviolet radiation, environmental tobacco smoke, diesel engine exhaust and silica, and for women, again, environmental tobacco smoke, other polyaromatic hydrocarbons, which are often the fumes that come from cooking, high heat cooking, ionising radiation, and again, solar UVR. There was a difference in your risk of being exposed by whether you interviewed in English or a language other than English. And you can see for every group that we examined, if you interviewed in Arabic, Mandarin, Cantonese or Vietnamese, you had a much higher risk of being exposed to a workplace carcinogen than if you interviewed in English. We had conducted exactly the same study the year prior, in 2012, but among Australian workers. This study involved 5,000 Australian workers, and the criteria was that they had to speak sufficient English to participate in the study. So that was the only difference between the migrant study and this one. So it gave us a good means of comparing data between the ethnic minority workers and Australian workers. So we limited this Australian cohort to only workers that were living in Sydney, Melbourne or Perth to make it comparable to the migrant study. This first column shows that there's not a big difference when you look at exposure to any carcinogens. So that's exposure to one of the 38 carcinogens. So 30% of Australian-born workers were exposed to one carcinogen, and it was 32% of the migrant group. However, there is a big, an increasing difference when you look within the different ethnic groups, with Arabic workers having nearly 40% of Arabic workers being exposed compared to 30% of Australian-born. This second row from the bottom shows the relative risk of being exposed by ethnic group compared with the Australian-born. You can see that for the Arabic group, there's a 23% increased risk, which is statistically significant. And the other groups, there's a tendency to have a higher risk of exposure, but it's not significant. And then the bottom row shows that once we adjust for occupation, that difference between ethnic groups attenuates. So what this is telling us is that the Arabic workers are working in different jobs than the Australian-born, and it's because they're working in different jobs that explains their differential exposure to at least one carcinogen. Here's a similar looking slide, but we're looking at specific carcinogens. And again, it's comparing the ethnic minority groups with the Australian-born workers. And the ones that I've highlighted are the groups and the carcinogen that's significantly different from the Australian-born workers. So, for example, that top line, solar UVR, Arabic workers are significantly likely to be exposed to solar UVR than Australian-born workers. Similarly, diesel exhaust is more likely to be exposed to diesel exhaust at work if you're an Arabic worker than if you're an Australian-born worker. Silica is higher for all workers apart from Chinese workers, and other PAHs is also higher for all the different ethnic groups. However, it's not always high. If you look at the Chinese group, they can their exposure to benzene is significantly lower than that of the Australian-born, and also to solar UVR. Chinese-born workers are less likely to be exposed to solar than Australian-born workers. Now, this slide is unadjusted for occupational groups, so that means that the differences that we could be seeing here are because they're working in different jobs. So this next slide is the same, however, we've adjusted for occupation. So now we're taking account of the different jobs that they might be working in. And you can see that there's still some differences. If we look at the row for silica, Arabic workers have a 2.5-fold increased risk of being exposed to silica than an Australian-born worker, and that's if they're working in the same sort of job. Similarly, with Vietnamese workers, they have a higher risk of being exposed to silica than an Australian-born worker working in similar jobs. And this one just shows the round circles just emphasise those that have that are still significantly different between the ethnic minority workers and the Australian-born workers after controlling for their job. So the possible reasons for the exposure differences, we've touched on them briefly. The first one is that they could be working in different jobs, so their likelihood of exposure is different. And we saw that for solar UVR, where we found that a greater proportion of the Arabic participants were working in occupations such as vehicle drivers and construction workers and painters. And so they had a greater risk of being exposed to solar UVR because their actual job was different than the sort of job that the Australian workers were doing. We also saw that in the other polyaromatic hydrocarbons, the smoke that's emitted from high heat cooking, where we found that many of our ethnic minority workers were working in food preparation jobs. Thus, they have higher exposure than Australians who weren't working in those sort of jobs. So for the PAHs and silica, once we controlled for occupation, the difference in exposure between the groups attenuated. But for some of the exposures, when we controlled for occupation, the difference didn't attenuate. And so that suggests that workers working in similar occupations are doing different tasks. So, for example, we found that the ethnic minority workers in construction were more likely to sweep and dust and to plaster and cut and set tiles than the Australian-born workers. So therefore, although they were all working in construction, the Arabic workers were more likely to work in jobs that increased their risk of being exposed to silica. Also, we found that most workers reported not using protective equipment, although it tended to be that more ethnic minority workers reported that they did use it compared to the Australian-born. So in conclusion, we found that work for migrants in Australia is still hazardous, that there was a differential exposure to carcinogens for a migrant group, for an ethnic minority group, than for the Australian-born workers, and that language, or specifically not speaking English, was a large determinant of their risk of exposure. Thank you.
Thank you very much.